Hello student, I'm Professor Smita Jha and I'm here to discuss Victorianism in English borders because we are discussing Victorian literature. So this is very important to know about the periphery of Victorian society. When Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, the British Empire was a loose assortment of colonies, mostly acquired for reasons of trade. By the time of her death, nearly 64 years later, the empire had expanded to become a coherent and dominant show of economic and political strength. As head of state, Queen Victoria presided over nearly a quarter of world's population. The period was marked by many important social and historical changes that altered the nation and its future course in many ways. The population of England nearly doubled. Its technological and industrial progress based on scientific innovations helped Britain become the most powerful country in the world. The implementation of the liberal regulative state emerging after the Napoleonic Wars involved several new departures. The first of these concerned the new machinery of government, which instead of relying on patronage and custom, involved an institutionalized bureaucracy. This was evident in the development of the factory inspectorate established by 1833 Factory Act. The characteristic way in which the state institutionalized itself was using local bodies, administering such areas as the fast developing realm of public health and the poor law. In fact, towns and cities themselves became very important new locations for the expression of the power of the decentralized state. After the 1835 Municipal Corporations Act, the local government became a major part of the new machinery of government. There was a great flowering of civic administration and civic pride during the early and mid-Victorian period in Britain. This was particularly reflected in the architecture and infrastructure of British cities, one of the most notable legacies of the period. Magnificent town halls, library, concert halls, museums, and not least the great civil engineering projects of the time all inculcated the virtues of civic identity and therefore of instituting civic power. Even as the country saw major economic progress, poverty and exploitation got deeply ingrained in its socio-political fabric. The gap between the rich and the poor increased significantly, and the drive for material and commercial success was seen to propagate a kind of moral decay in the society itself. The changing landscape of the country was a major concern. While the earlier phase of Romanticism saw a celebration of the countryside and the rich landscape of the flora and fauna, the Victorian era saw a changing of the landscape to one of burgeoning industry and factories. While the poor were exploited for their labor, the period witnessed the rise of bourgeoisie or the middle class due to increasing trade between Britain and its colonies, and the Reform Bill of 1832 strengthened their hold. There was also a shift from the romantic ideals of the previous age towards a more realistic acceptance and depiction of society. This shift was reflected in the literature of the time, with writers such as Charles Dickens and Elizabeth Gaskell providing vivid portrayals of the harsh realities faced by the working class in the rapidly industrializing cities. Painters like John Everett Méliès and William Holman Hunt also captured the gritty urban landscapes and the struggles of the poor. The formal political system was a constitutional monarchy. It was in practice dominated by aristocratic men. The British Constitution was and is unwritten and consists of a combination of written laws and unwritten conventions. At the national level, government consisted of the monarch and the two houses of parliament, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. During the Victorian period, the House of Commons became the center of government. The House of Lords lost power, though it remained influential until the Parliament Act of 1911, and the monarchy transformed into a symbol of the nation. The House of Commons consisted of about 600 men called members of parliament who were elected to represent the counties and borough of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. England had many more representatives than the other three nations. By virtue of its status as first among these four equals, the product of traditions, as well as its greater political power and wealth. The upper house, the House of Lords, was populated principally by several hundred noblemen who had life tenures. Members of both houses were wealthy men. Formal national politics was dominated by two major parties, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. For discussions on the Victorian age, questions about foreign conquest, imperial administration, the justness of wars, and the ethics of cross cultural interactions are crucial. An important point that comes up time and again in this discussion is how the realms of the international and empire were defined and legitimized over time. The lack of attention paid to the empire by both the political elite and the public was itself a theme and a lament woven through Victorian imperial thought. J.R. Sleepy protested that historians habitually relegated imperial affairs to supplementary chapters and lambasted the mid century system of indifference that had threatened the unity of empire. This echoed John Stuart Mill's earlier complaint about the indifference to foreign affairs displayed by the British public, and J.A. Froude's claim that indifference about the existence and fate of the empire was endemic. This was certainly an exaggeration, but the trope of indifference reflected both an authentic concern with the parochialism of much British intellectual exchange and a case of a special pleading by those heavily involved in colonial affairs. Disinterested analysis of the empire and foreign policy were rare, and imperial international thought was enmeshed in political advocacy and contestation. Ultimately, this complex interplay of ideas and attitudes underscores the challenges historians face in untangling the legacy of British imperial thought and its implications for understanding the intellectual landscape of the Victorian era and its lasting impact on the conceptualization of international relations. Two regions stand out for the relative dearth of work on Victorian visions of global order. The first concern the role played today by the canon of great thinker in the selection of appropriate subjects for research. Aside from Karl Marx, whose impact at the time was relatively slight, and John Stuart Mill, no Victorian thinker plays a major part in the story that political theorists tell themselves about their past. Also, many of the prominent figures of the time, including Thomas Macaulay, Herbert Spencer, T.H. Green, L.T. Hobhouse, J.A. Hobson, Henry Menn, Henry Sidgwick, Seeley, and James Fitzjames Stephen barely rate a mention for these theorists. To develop a comprehensive understanding of the imperial and international thought of the era, political theorists need to widen the aperture of their gaze, moving beyond the self-limiting confines of the canon. The 19th century could appropriately be called the English century, just like the next one could be called the American century. The 19th century belonged to England in every way. The great British Empire covered large parts of the world. Britain's overseas trading surpassed that of Italy, France, and Germany combined. And in 1870, it was nearly 4 times the size of American overseas market. There was mostly peace throughout the empire, which was referred to as Pax Britannica. England ruled the waves, and at home, the industry was flourishing. The thriving and industrious Victorians represented the cutting edge of enterprising and innovative industry, railway, postal service, steamships, spinning machines. It all happened in 19th century England, the workshop of the world. Queen Victoria and her henchmen were pure imperialists who put nearly three-quarters of the world under British rule or at heaven's command, as they boldly put it. There are more places in the world named after Queen Victoria than any other person. The little lady dressed in black after her consort Prince Albert died became the icon of the greatest nation in the world. A consequence of the industrialization of England was a migration to the fast growing cities, particularly in the Midlands and the North. Cities that were not prepared for taking on the rapidly growing population. Poor and overcrowded accommodation with no sanitary facilities, unregulated and often dangerous working conditions in factories and mills. These were the circumstances for the growing English working class in mid 1800s. At the same time, another group emerged in increasing numbers, the middle class, factory owners, proprietors, and businessmen. They were hardworking, thrifty, and frugal family men living in moderate luxury according to the standards of the age. And they increasingly challenged the land leadership of the aristocracy or upper class in setting the political and economic agenda. The Victorian period defined and cemented the class system that has characterized English society since then. At the bottom of the system were the unemployed and destitute people in the city slums, who either ended up in the workhouses or on the street trying to make a living as thieves, pickpockets, and prostitutes. Imperialism may be defined as the sustained effort to assimilate a country or region to the political, economic, or cultural system of another power. Formal imperialism aimed to achieve this object by the explicit transfer of sovereignty and usually the imposition of direct administrative control. Its informal counterpart relied upon the links created by trade, investment, or diplomacy, often supplemented by unequal treaties and periodic armed intervention. Quite small powers could and did enter this game in diverse geographical settings. However, the complex characteristics of imperialism were most clearly visible in the expansion of a strong Western states into the extra-European periphery. No other power developed more varied and far-reaching imperial relationship than Victorian Britain. The futility of trying to make sense of Victorian expansion in terms of territorial or formal empire alone has long been recognized. But the central problem of Victorian imperialism remains how to explain why informal imperialism became the vehicle of expansion where it did. Why formal empire was extended in some regions but not others, and why only some zones of informal imperialism were later absorbed into the formal empire. In short, how should we explain the peculiar configuration of the world system bequeathed by the Victorians? Should we treat it as a finished artifact or as the unfinished handiwork of drift and opportunism? Did the strange course of Victorian imperialism derive mainly from the logic of public policymakers, or was it the outcome of decentralized and pluralistic political system only occasionally capable of imposing discipline and direction on its external activity? Informal imperialism was not a policy nor even a recognized formula for the assertion of influence. It represented a pragmatic acceptance of limited power. Far from being the best of all possible imperial worlds, informal empire could be a tense and unstable relationship whose purpose was often painful and sometimes violent transformation of an undeveloped economy and its socio-political institution. The instinct of private British interest was to force the pace towards political and economic change where they could, where they dared, and where they commanded the support of the imperial center. In favorable circumstances, foreign traders, evangelists, or land speculator destabilized an extra European polity extremely quickly. Once a cycle of persistent instability was set in motion, the probability of foreign intervention and then annexation became greater and greater. One of the forms of informal imperialism was the phenomenon of cultural dominion called Victorianism. A Victorian culture arose even in the United States as it was undergoing a crucial transformation. It was a time of industrialization, knowledge explosion, immigration, and vast population growth, urbanization, geographical expansion, changing race relationship, and the greatest armed conflict on American soil. But Victorianism in Britain and America developed within significantly different contexts. The segment of British society that identified with bourgeois evangelicalism is usually thought the most characteristically Victorian. In England, such people lived at the periphery of polite society and political power. In America, the dominated economic, social, political institution. Aristocratic culture patterns against which middle class Victorian standards often had to contend in Britain were weak in the United States. For this reason, one could argue that Victorian culture was experienced more intensely in the United States than in Victoria's homeland. On the other hand, American Victorianism was not without its rivals and adversaries, as the presence of so many ethnic minority groups gave the United States a wider cultural diversity. Sometimes, as we know, the word culture is applied narrowly to the prestigious arts. At the opposite extreme, it can mean everything, material or otherwise, created by mankind. For our purposes, however, culture can be defined as an evolving system of beliefs, attitudes, and techniques transmitted from generation to generation and finding expression in innumerable activities people learn: religion, politics, child rearing, customs, as well as the arts and professions. In Australia, new provinces were set up, Victoria in 1835 and South Australia in 1842. The focus shifted from the transportation of criminals to voluntary immigration. New Zealand became a British colony in 1839. In 1840, Maori chiefs ceded sovereignty to Britain in Treaty of Waitangi. In 1841, New Zealand became an autonomous colony. The signing of Treaty of Nanking in 1842 ended the First Opium War and gave Britain control over Hong Kong Island. However, a disastrous retreat from Kabul in the same year led to the annihilation of a British army column in Afghanistan. Later, in 1845, the Great Famine began to cause mass starvation in colonized Ireland, where widespread disease and death sparked large-scale immigration. The Victorian gold rush began in 1851. Then, in 1853, Britain fought alongside France in the Crimean War. The goal was to ensure that Russia could not benefit from the declining status of the Ottoman Empire, a strategic consideration known as the Eastern Question. The conflict marked a rare breach in the Pax Britannica, the period of relative peace that existed among the great powers of the time. On its conclusion in 1856, with the Treaty of Paris, Russia was prohibited from hosting a military presence in Crimea. In October of the same year, the Second Opium War saw Britain overpower the Qing dynasty in China. Along with other major powers, Britain took steps to obtain a special trading and legal rights in a limited number of treaty ports. It was during the Crimean War that the Queen introduced the Victoria Cross. It was awarded on the basis of valor and merit regardless of rank. The first crosses were handed out to 62 men in a ceremony of Hyde Park in 1857. The first time officers and men were decorated together. During 1857-58, an uprising by sepoys against the East India Company was suppressed. This event led to the end of company rule in India. The power was transferred to the British Crown. The princely estates were not affected and remained under British guidance. English was imposed as the medium of education. In 1861, Prince Albert died and Queen Victoria went into mourning, withdrawing from public life for 10 years. That year, Britain purchased Egypt's share in the Suez Canal as the African nation was forced to raise money to pay off its debts. During the American Civil War, the British government decided to remain neutral upon realizing that war with the United States would be highly dangerous for the country, provided much of Britain's food supply, especially wheat, and its navy could sink much of the merchant fleet. Charles Francis Adams Sr., the US ambassador to Britain, succeeded in resolving many thorny problems that could have driven the two powers into war. Queen Victoria's diary entries suggest she had contemplated the possibility of a union of her North American colonies as early as February 1865. She wrote, under quote, "We must struggle for it. And far the best it would be to let it go as an independent kingdom under an English prince." She also mentioned how her late husband, Prince Albert, had hoped that one day their sons would rule over their British colonies. Canada was another power that maintained strong ties with the Queen. Victoria in British Columbia and Victoria Country in Nova Scotia were named after her. The list also includes Regina in Saskatchewan, named in her honor, Prince Edward Island in her father's, and Alberta for her daughter. Her birthday, Victoria Day, is an official public holiday in Canada. In 1871, just a year after the France expelled its emperor, Republican sentiments grew in Britain. After Prince Edward recovered from typhoid, the Queen decided to give a public Thanksgiving service and appeared on the balcony of the Buckingham Palace. This marked the beginning of a return to public life, signaling a renewed engagement with her subjects. Key leaders included conservatives Benjamin Disraeli and Robert Gascoigne Cecil, third Marquis of Salisbury, and liberals William Ewart Gladstone, the Earl of Rosebery, and William Harcourt. They introduced various reforms aimed at strengthening the political autonomy of large industrial cities and increasing British involvement in the international stage. Labor movements were recognized and integrated to combat extremism. The Fabian Society was founded in London by a group of left-leaning middle-class intellectuals, including Edward R. Pease, Havelock Ellis, and E. Nesbitt, to promote socialism. Both Queen Victoria and Prince Albert favored moderate improvements to the condition of workers. The Maisonneuve policies extended by the British Crown included rapid succession, the complete abolition of slavery in the African possessions, the end of transportation of convicts to Australia, loosened restriction on colonial trade, and the introduction of responsible government. These developments reflected a significant shift in British society as the government sought to address the needs of its citizens while navigating the complexities of imperialism. Victoria was also influential in establishing the modern monarchy, moving toward a more public, friendly family value and ceremonial institution. Victoria and her husband Albert were viewed by the public largely as the ideal couple, and they garnered a reputation for benevolent Christian humanitarians owing to the various causes they championed. Victoria and Albert were noted abolitionists and supported Royal Navy deployments to West Africa in an effort to stop illegal slave trading. Yet, this reputation sets ill at ease with the reality of imperial rule and expansion under Victoria. Whilst the monarchy did become more ceremonial over her 64-year reign, she wielded palpable influence, particularly around imperial policy. David Livingstone led famous expedition in Central Africa, positioning Britain for favorable expansion of its colonial system in the scramble for Africa during the 1880s. There were numerous revolts and violent conflicts in the British Empire, but there were no wars with other major nations. In South Africa, tension escalated, especially with the discovery of gold, which intensified competition and conflict among various groups vying for control of the lucrative resources. The result was the First Boer War in 1880-1881 and the intensely bitter Second Boer War in 1899-1902. The British finally prevailed but lost prestige at home and abroad. The first conflict is sometimes described as marking the beginning of the decline of the British Empire. These wars exposed the vulnerabilities of British military power and highlighted the growing discontent among colonial subjects. The conflicts also fueled nationalist sentiments in many colonies. Victoria's relationship with India is best described as exoticizing and orientalist. She styled herself in the 1860s as Empress of India, a title that would later be officially bestowed upon her by Parliament in 1876. Victoria saw herself as heir to the Mughal empress. To this effect, she wore the Kohinoor diamond on her crown. However, this self styled imperial identity was deeply problematic as it reduced a rich and diverse culture to an exotic other, hence justifying colonial domination. She held this Orientalist attitude towards many other colonies of Britain as well. One example of this was the adoption of Aina, the princess of Igabo clan, taken prisoner by the king of Dahomey. A British officer negotiated her freedom in 1850 specifically as a gift for Victoria. In England, Aina was stripped of her name and was christened Sarah Forbes Bonetta. Victoria acted as the child's patron and godmother, readily taking up the cause of poor little Dahoman captive. Victoria was well informed of colonial policy. While she was a self declared anti racist and humanitarian, she was also an advocate for imperialism. She justified the empire on the basis that the British were kind rulers, especially when compared to other European. She was kept regularly informed of developments and often, as in the South African War, displayed a keen determination that the cause of British imperialism should prevail. Under Victoria, members of the royal family began to participate more in the ceremonial activities. Her son and heir, the future Edward VII, visited India many times in an official capacity. These visits are the origins of the modern day Commonwealth tour and the PR monarchy. As the monarchy gradually lost more of its political power over the running of the empire, it assumed more and more ceremonial power. As discussed before, the Victorian Empire experienced major changes that affected the living standards profoundly. Economic, scientific, medical, and technological advances contributed to rapid population growth. The population at the end of the Victorian period doubled the population at the beginning of the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution also resulted in many poor people from all over the world immigrating to urban places for work opportunities. In these urban settings, the workers and employers clashed with each other for their own capitalist interest. However, as compared with the earlier century, it is seen that these people were much wealthier and prosperous in every sense. High wages, political liberty, such as the enfranchisement of men, educational reforms, and the emergence of new women who were educated and career oriented all indicated a rapidly developing and democratizing empire. The 19th century British political and social thought had a deep influence on the central ideas of government, such as conservatism, liberalism, feminism, and socialism, in the light of industrial changes, their revolutionary consequences, and democratic movements. These ideas continued to resonate and evolve, shaping contemporary debates on the role of government, individual rights, and the pursuit of equality and justice in an increasingly complex world. Both industrial revolution and democratization were two significant developments that shaped the rise of these ideologies. Together with capitalist policies and the rise of British Empire, radical changes and revolutions in British history deeply affected the role of the individual in society and the role of government by pushing for inevitable changes in public policies and public consciousness. The dismal working conditions of people in factories due to industrialization led to socialist movement and demands for more democratic governance. Through the late Victorian period, the suffering middle class woman under the dominance of patriarchy also found the solution in education, which enabled them to have a better say over their fate. These women were later recognized as first wave feminists who ushered in a new era of better opportunities for women. With this, I conclude the whole discussion. Let us meet in the next lecture with a new topic under the umbrella term that is Victorian literature. Thank you.